Welcome back, everyone. Today we've got a brand new explainer, and we're looking at a topic that's been making some serious waves lately. We are objectively exploring the multifaceted and honestly highly emotional reactions to Australia's massive new gun buyback program. This is the biggest initiative of its kind in decades, and the response from regional communities has been intense. We're going to break down the actual source material straight from those on the ground to understand exactly why this policy is creating such a massive ripple effect. Okay, let's dive right into this. We're going to map out the ripple effects of this policy today. We'll hit the buyback announcement, the financial reality, look beyond just the numbers, dive into the mental health toll, and finally, wrap up with the rural political shift. Let's get to it. All right, part one, the buyback announcement, the catalyst for debate. And, well, this right here brilliantly illustrates the core tension right out of the gate. On one hand, you've got the government. They're framing this whole initiative purely through the lens of national safety, citing the tragic Bondi terror attack as a catalyst to get weapons off the streets. But conversely, you have the immediate backlash from opponents, including rural industry reps. Their perspective is that these laws miss the mark entirely. They argue it unfairly targets heavily scrutinized, law-abiding owners instead of actual criminals. To really grasp just how blindsided the rural community felt, we gotta look at the timeline. Literally just a day before the Prime Minister and the Premier made their official announcement, there was a huge forum. 500 community members and industry representatives gathered to hear from One Nation and the Australian Shooters Union about potential future changes. Those attendees had absolutely no idea that a massive buyback was going to be announced the very next morning. As industry insider Marty Burke described it, waking up to that official press conference was a complete surprise and incredibly disheartening. That lack of a heads-up set a tone of immediate distrust. Moving on to Section 2, the financial reality and the industry impact. So when the government rolled out the buyback, they also announced a transitional grant to help out the firearms industry. The figure? $25,000 per business. But, as you might guess, that number didn't exactly land well. Marty Burke, who owns Gunpro out in regional New South Wales, bluntly called it a real slap in the face. He says 25 grand is basically insignificant to his business right now. And to understand why an industry professional would turn down a $25,000 grant, we have to look at what these businesses have actually been going through recently. Because here's the kicker. According to reports from the ground, firearms dealers have already suffered a staggering 90% drop in overall gun sales over the past 7 months leading up to the announcement. The anticipation, all the rumors, the regulatory environment, it's completely frozen their market. So, let's map out this economic cascade step by step. First, you get that crippling 90% decrease in sales. Then, as a direct result, severe financial and mental stress just crushes these small business owners. And finally, step 3, long-standing local stores are forced to either shut down completely or lay off their staff. When you look at the $25,000 grant through that specific lens, you kind of start to see why industry leaders feel like the government is just throwing them a bone while their livelihoods collapse around them. Okay, Section 3, beyond the numbers, practical and sentimental value. Now, a really common disconnect between urban policymakers and rural residents is the actual everyday utility of firearms. For a lot of folks out in regional areas, these aren't weapons of conflict. They're standard agricultural tools. We're talking sporting shooters doing target practice at the family range, sure, but crucially, we're talking about primary producers, farmers. For them, a firearm is a daily necessity. They rely on them for vital pest control, managing massive populations of feral pigs and other invasive animals that threaten crops and livestock. Then you have this entirely different layer, sentimental value. The government proposed 10 gun caps as a safety measure. But out in rural communities, you might have farmers holding on to 7 or 8 inherited, multi-generational family firearms. These guns are often totally unfired, rusty, and just locked away in a safe. It puts them completely at odds with this modern idea of an active arsenal. Now, what's really interesting here is an analogy from one owner explaining their inherited firearm. It brilliantly bridges the empathy gap. They said, "To me, it's no different to a piece of jewelry given to you by your mother." That completely reframes the debate, doesn't it? It takes the object from being just a tool and turns it into a cherished family heirloom. And this means offering a standardized, cash buyback fundamentally misunderstands the emotional attachment to these specific items. To an owner, a rusty old .22 rifle handed down from a grandfather might be functionally useless, but there's no way they'd sell it for $5,000 because to them, it's priceless family history. A standardized cash for guns exchange just does not account for heritage. Which brings us to Section 4, the mental health toll, a community under strain. Before we dive into the individual level, let's look at the systemic frustration. A massive grievance compounding this mental health strain is that industry reps claim there's been absolutely zero government consultation with them over the past 7 months. Politicians say they're open to listening, yet the industry argues nobody from the government reached out to consult about the gun caps or how they'd be implemented. They feel entirely ignored. Let's look at a specific anecdote that perfectly captures this strain. Follow this timeline. A customer comes into a shop completely distressed. His great-grandfather used a .303 Lee-Enfield rifle in World War II. For decades of peace, that historical artifact has sat safely, totally unfired, inside a heavily scrutinized legal gun safe. And now, under the new laws, the owner feels he's being told he has to surrender that tangible piece of his family's history for a $1,000 payout. The reality of these policies on the ground is raw and it's emotional. We are seeing reports of grown men out in regional Australia literally being reduced to tears in local shops. They feel overwhelmingly targeted by these new laws. They're deeply upset that they're being treated as a threat to national safety, especially when they view themselves as some of the most law-abiding, heavily scrutinized citizens in the country. This isn't just about losing property, it's triggering genuine mental health crises in farming communities that are already under immense pressure. And finally, Section 5, a rural political shift, the ballot box reaction. So the big question we really have to ask ourselves is, how is this localized frustration and emotional distress actually impacting the ballot box? What does this mean for the political landscape? Let's see how this builds into a very stark political reality. Listen to the sentiment from rural voters. On one side, you have what they're derisively calling the uniparty. You've got lifelong national and liberal voters openly saying they view their traditional parties as being just as much to blame as Labor. They feel completely abandoned. But on the flip side, you're seeing rising alternatives like One Nation or Judas Fisher's party. And look, whether you agree with these alternative parties or not, the critical data point here is that they're being perceived by rural voters as the only ones actually listening to their grievances. Because the firearms debate, it's really just the tip of the iceberg here. When you summarize the core political grievances driving this rural shift, it paints a much broader picture. These voters are fed up with what they see as constant government intervention. They're sick of feeling like their rights are being taken away by people who just don't understand their lifestyles. They feel dictated to without any meaningful consultation, and ultimately, they just have a strong desire to live their lives in peace without government overreach. The buyback has basically become the latest, most visible symptom of a massive urban-rural disconnect. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly complex question. How can governments effectively balance urgent, broad-brush national safety initiatives with the deeply ingrained historical, practical, and emotional realities of rural communities? It's a fascinating and difficult policy tightrope. And as we've seen today, when that balance is off, the ripple effects are profound. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I hope this helps you understand the deeper mechanics at play here. See you next time.